Hello, it is Gabriel, and I'm here with volume 14 of this education series. Today, I'm going to be talking about systemic risk and liquidity. Two of my favorite topics. Let me tell you, you're in for a good one today. This was, yeah, they sure turned Western Mass into North Pole for, yeah. Anyway, in my last video I was talking about, I ended with the idea that a military can be used, well, the military, if you have a strong military and a relatively strong military, you have an incentive to seize or tax and control trade, seize trading routes and seize wealth, and that means that strong military powers become very wealthy, and then if you trace people like the Knights of Malta and other very wealthy groups, they typically are aligned with kingdoms that are centered in high frequency trading places, trade routes basically. So like Constantinople is a great one, and maybe there's others as well. So those armies can actually become private, just mercenaries, and then serve, whoever is willing to bend the knee to them. And that's what happens with groups like the Knights of Malta and the Teutonic Knights and people like that. And then they become very powerful and exercise a great deal of control. And, if no one can trade because they have no liquidity, or if no one can trade because they can't access trading partners, then there's a lot of a different quality of life that's available. So you could see how not only do you have more power and more control, but you can also really have a negative impact on the quality of life that people are experiencing. And that's what history shows, is that trade typically goes through these huge cycles of rise and fall, and there's dramatic shifts in trade that take place. And the greatest example would be in 1929. There was this guy who wrote a letter, and I'll put a link for more information about this. I put the link in my last one. Anyway, there was a guy who wrote a letter to the stockholders of his bank saying major depression imminent, and then the stock market tanked, and he had to pump $25 million into the stock market. And then by the end of the Great Depression, $200 billion of asset values had diminished, and that was like similar to the amount that World War II had cost. So that gives you an idea of just how much money we're talking about here in terms of fluctuations when people are trying to change liquidity. And so, all right, this is about systemic risk, and one of the ways you can assess whether or not there is a risk in the present system or in the present time is you can look at asset valuations, because asset valuations are very highly tied to debt, because one of the ways this kind of works is that you'll see a big rise in debt. That debt is being given to people who are buying things. That drives up the price of things, and it drives it up to an artificial level. At that point, the richest people typically will sell because they are the ones controlling the issuance of debt, and they know that they can stop issuing the debt and buy back in at a lower price because people won't have access to credit. And that's exactly what they do. They wait until everyone's in debt, and then they remove the capacity to borrow money, and no one can repay their debts because that debt is a fiat currency fiat currency influx into the monetary supply that stimulates the economy. So you get this economic stimulus, and it unfortunately leads to higher asset values, and it's done in a kind of boom-bust way, in kind of too large of a way, and then contracted too quickly because people are trying to cause a liquidity crunch. So the basic tenet of financial systemic risk is that debt is going to drive a liquidity increase to a level that inflates asset values, and then that there's going to be a drastic change in asset values afterwards. And then that drastic change in asset values is typically a decline as debt decreases, and then sometimes there's like a response to increase debt, like we saw in 2008, where the Federal Reserve loaned out like 20 or 30 trillion dollars to the banks, and sometimes there isn't. It just depends on who's in control of debt issues. And in our country and many other countries, we have central banks that have monopolies on currency and debt. A currency issue is just a debt issue, basically, because of fiat currency and fractional reserve banking. Anyway, we have a lot of problems because of our banking system, and we are luckily not facing those issues right now because Donald Trump does have control of the Federal Reserve. So we can all kind of talk about these liquidity crunches and be like feeling a little more comfortable, you know, which is a nice thing. So shout out to Donald Trump and the RICO Act. The RICO Act allows people to prosecute criminal organizations, and that's how they are in control of the banks right now. And that's why that's why we can learn about UFOs and stuff like that. Okay, so what are some good examples besides 1929, 2000? Let's talk about 2008 really quick. So in 2008, there was a senator who testified that in the course of 3 hours, there was a huge reduction in the balance sheets of many of the banks. I'll try and find a link for that. SGT report talks about it. There was a senator who talks about how there was via digital reductions, digital transfers of wealth caused a huge change in the balance sheets of the banks. And then since they have huge derivative portfolios, as soon as that happens, they have to call in their loans. So in addition to reductions in credit triggering a currency or a liquidity crunch, you can also see a overextension of liabilities on the parts of banks, and then a transfer of what amounts to credit, or a transfer of currency away from those banks. And that's what happened in 2008, where in the span of like 3 hours, like billions of dollars was like just changed hands in the financial system. But then because of derivatives, that led to an immediate crash in the in the financial markets. So that was pretty crazy, and it's pretty crazy that can happen, and it did happen. So I've written about this pretty extensively. If you want to see more examples of this, I'll put a link down below. But yeah, I can just go through more examples. But let me just get the fire going a little bit. We had some things going on over here.